Ashish Bhandari, Managing Director and CEO of Thamax Group, and along with him, Samant Sinha, Chairman and CEO of Renew Power. They both join us. Mr. Sinha, Mr. Bhandari, thank you for joining us. Mr. Sinha, the hydrogen policy, good statement, important that India migrates to a new clean source of fuel. But what is the difference between intention and actual implementation? What are the bottlenecks? What are the challenges? And how effective do you think this policy will be?
Thank you so much for having me on the show. Well, look, that's a ton of questions that you asked me in that one question of yours. Um, Look, I think that green hydrogen is an absolute essential requirement for India as a country. The reason being that India imports a tremendous amount of fossil fuels, as we all know, almost $150 billion every year. And that number is increasing and will double over the next 7 to 10 years. Green hydrogen is a way for India to find some degree of independency from fossil fuels by replacing a lot of the gray hydrogen, which, the feedstock for which is very often LNG, uh, and essentially replace that with hydrogen that we can make within the country using renewable energy. So I think it's a very important method for us to wean our dependence on imports. Now, the second part of your question was, what is the gap between implementation and the policy? Look, I think it's very important that we get the right policies both on the demand side and the supply side. I think the policy that came out yesterday was more focused on the supply side, which is how to actually make the renewable energy part of it a little bit cheaper, how to store the green hydrogen or ammonia that is to be formed for exports. So I think it was really focused on those kinds of things, allowing the renewable energy to be produced in one part of India and shipped to another part of India through using the interstate transmission network, which I think is very critical. So all of those things are really focused on that part of the equation. I think from this point on, the government has to now start thinking about how to essentially encourage people to move towards using green hydrogen and really creating the demand side of the equation. So I think that is something that we still have to wait and see. But at least the supply side has been addressed to some extent, and that will hopefully allow the costs of producing green hydrogen to come down. And as that comes down and you create the demand side, over time, you will have the creation of a fairly large industry where India can also essentially become a net exporter of green hydrogen through the form of ammonia as well. So I think a lot of very positive things in this. First of all, the government's intent, which is very clear. The second, that they've moved to make some of these things possible. And now we need to see a lot of the other actions coming into place. And I think a few years from now, you'll probably see a very large green hydrogen slash ammonia industry developing in the country.
Mr. Sinha, can you break it for our viewers that what have been the global parallels? Is clean green hydrogen more like still at a lab experiment stage, or commercially it is possible? And how far do you think we are behind the curve? Like EVs, the experimentation started almost a decade ago. We've in reality seen the first EV rollout about 2 3 years ago in India.
Yeah, look, I don't think that as far as green hydrogen is concerned, that we are behind the curve at all. You know that India runs one of the largest renewable energy programs anywhere in the world, and renewable energy accounts for 70% of the cost of green hydrogen. So this is a new and emerging industry anywhere in the world at this point in time. Of course, the costs of green hydrogen are still higher than that people can get from using other sources of making hydrogen, which is really called gray hydrogen in a sense. And that's everywhere in the world. And so, therefore, at this point, globally, people have not shifted to green hydrogen, but the visibility of cost reduction is there. Given the cost reduction that we've seen on the renewable energy side, it is likely to play out similarly in the manufacture of green hydrogen. And that will happen over the next, I would say, 4 to 5 years. Now, how the question is, how do you actually get the cost down? You have to get the cost down by getting people to start adopting green hydrogen, creating the scale that is required, the technology and the ecosystem that is required to bring costs down. So it's a bit of chicken and egg. And I think what you have to do is you have to start creating green hydrogen mandates for people to start adopting some degree of green hydrogen. Using that, create the scale to bring down costs. So it's a little bit of you have to really work on both ends of this to make the whole thing happen. And that is really what the government has started doing. But make no mistake, this is happening everywhere in the world right now at the same time. India is not behind the curve at all. In fact, India is in some ways taking the lead. And if you read the intent of the national policy that was announced yesterday, it essentially tries to make India in an exporter potentially of green hydrogen. And that is possible because A, we have really cheap renewable energy at this point in India, and two, because we are actually on the same part of the curve as anybody else is, and therefore we can actually use our country to provide a base for exports for green hydrogen, and thereby leapfrog to some extent this whole industry. So I would say we are actually playing not catch up at all. We're actually trying to take leadership in this industry, which I think is a real positive.
Okay, so that's Sumant Sinha talking about how India can be in the leadership role when it comes to green hydrogen. Mr. Bhandari, if I can come to you, this is Nayantara. When it comes to green hydrogen, there is, of course, the entry cost as well, right? Yesterday, I was in conversation with a startup backed by Aadhar Poonawalla, who was saying that green hydrogen can sometimes cost 4x more than regular energy, fossil fuel energy. How big a problem is that going to be?
The price differential that you have currently between what would be grey hydrogen, as someone call it, and green hydrogen is quite significant. And that price difference is driven both by the cost of generation of electricity, which is more than 50% of the cost of generating that green hydrogen. And that includes the cost of distribution and then the electrolysis part of it. What the government's trying to do is to address each part of that cost equation. The first, I think, on the electricity side, especially on the transmission side, the hydrogen announcement yesterday goes a long way in addressing some of the questions. Some of the state elements of what the state governments have authority and ability to do is still an open bit, but it's a step in the right direction. Next comes the electrolysis part, which is the other 30 to 50% of the cost, which the government expects to bring down by supporting manufacturing, giving tax breaks, coming up with PLI schemes so that the hardware and the equipment part of the green hydrogen generation part cost also comes down. Even after you do that, I think for the next 3 years, even longer possibly, there will be a viability gap between what grey hydrogen is at and what green hydrogen is at. And there the government will have to come in, support funding of some of the critical projects, get certain government PSUs, fertilizer companies, petrochemical companies to buy green hydrogen almost mandatorily, like you need to have 10% blending of green hydrogen or something of that sort that creates a demand side momentum as well, like Sumant was saying. So the supply part is being addressed. Now the demand part needs to get addressed and not look at whether you are at 100 rupees per kg today. Aim to get to that number 3 to 4 years from now. And knowing that between now and the next 3 years, you are in this global marketplace where you have to be competitive, looking to bring your cost curve down, not focusing on what the gap is today. But the gap's a real question. Yep. Without government support, industry will have a tough time bridging the gap by themselves.
You've talked about the new hydrogen policy being more supply side driven. How, in your view, can this arbitrage be addressed to make sure the demand exists?
Yeah, so look, that's the other part that we're waiting for. So I think one of the things that the government could look at doing essentially is that just like you have a renewable purchase obligation target for consumers of power, which actually requires them to have a certain minimum amount of renewable energy in their overall power basket. Similarly, for consumers of hydrogen, green hydrogen right now, you can specify that they have to have a minimum amount of green hydrogen, and that percentage can keep increasing over time. Now, what that would do is essentially create demand for green hydrogen, which then, with all the supply side interventions, could be possibly supplied. Now, obviously, in the beginning, the cost of green hydrogen will be higher, but it will come down over time and come down quite rapidly. So I think green hydrogen purchase obligation targets are one simple way of providing demand that is required. Now, the question is on whom should this be applicable? It would be applicable on refineries which use a lot of gray hydrogen, on fertilizer companies that use ammonia as a feedstock, and that ammonia essentially can be made from green hydrogen rather than gray hydrogen. Eventually, it can be used also by, or it can be also be applicable on users of LNG, and you can actually replace LNG as a feedstock as well by green hydrogen. So there are multiple industries where you can actually mandate that a certain amount of their consumption, which is currently coming in from gray hydrogen or LNG, can essentially be replaced by green hydrogen and thereby create demand. Now, the demand in India right now, the consumption in India right now of gray hydrogen is about 6 million tons. And that is expected to grow to double of this in the next 8 to 10 years. Now, so you can initially say that, look, please replace 5% or 10% of the total amount of gray hydrogen with green over the next 3 to 5 years, right? So that will create the demand side. You have the supply side interventions already happening, and therefore you'll start bridging the gap that Ashish talked about slowly and but steadily. And the expectation is that 4 to 5 years from now, that gap would have come down to almost nothing, and then it won't be, you won't require mandates any longer because everybody would really naturally gravitate towards green hydrogen rather than gray hydrogen. So I think that's the way you have to really go about doing this.
Now, Mr. Sinha, I've had the opportunity of interviewing you as well as L&T together on your green hydrogen plans, and we played that interview on ET Now. So the next question will be for Thermax and Mr. Bhandari. You tell us, Mr. Bhandari, what is Thermax's plans when it comes to green hydrogen? And would yesterday's policy be good enough for companies like yours to maybe step on the gas?
We definitely intend to step on the gas. I think green hydrogen for the nation and for addressing climate change is a certainty. So it's not a question of if it will happen, and it will happen in the short term, and the short is 1 to 3 years period. We will see a big transition. So for most players that are in the energy space, we have to think about what that means. And we are taking that very, very seriously. Specifically to the policy, I think as Suman said, let's look at this as one of multiple parts that will come out to the policy. Now that the central governments come up with an electricity policy, we'll have to see how the state governments look at it. Next, we will have to see how the demand side, which is what does MOPNG come up with, what incentives does PLI come up with. So let's see how the rest of the ecosystem develops and what purchase obligations the steel ministry comes up with. And so we will see a lot of announcements in the coming months that all connect to building a hydrogen economy in India. So let's look at this as one of many things that happen. For companies like Thermax, there are multiple roles that we can play. First is just the entire execution and capability of designing a project around green hydrogen, the ability to bring electricity into play, but more designing the project from electrolyzer, the power management, all the software around it, the application, how does something get blended, what can get blended, how much can it get blended, bringing the science around it and to be able to set up an entire project, from an EPC perspective. That's something that Thermax is building capability for. Next, which is the whole electrolyzer question. Many companies in India will now look at, okay, how do I set up electrolyzer capability? What portion of it I can leverage our own capabilities for, what portion comes from global partnerships that companies will now look at. And many, including Renew, is doing that already. Many others, including Thermax, are looking at all of those options. This is very, very important and at the heart of every strategy that Thermax is looking at going forward as well.
Okay, so let's see how all of those plans progress. Renew Power, of course, has entered into a joint venture with L&T as far as green hydrogen goes. The rest of India Inc., we've heard noises from Reliance Industries, as well as the Adani Group, which has already set up a company for the same. First question to you is, and as someone who's got such a large footprint also when it comes into the energy landscape, via the generators and the power generation, etc. This is a time when everything is about going green. We're talking a day, right, after the new green hydrogen policy had also been unveiled. So first up, how is Cummins India, can I say, pivoting towards this theme?
I think it's a very valid and a pertinent question given the broader intent of the government to be net zero by 2070. Obviously, when you look at our journey from now till then, there'll be multiple different ways in which the goals will be accomplished. To begin with, by itself, the emission standards which are applicable to stationary applications like gensets or off-highway applications or industrial applications that we support, they themselves will evolve and become stringent as we go forward. As an example, the CPCB 4 plus norms will be applicable sometime from July 2023 onwards. So that by itself will help in terms of reducing the extent of emissions. Looking at some of these newer technologies like hydrogen and fuel cell, obviously from a Cummins standpoint, we have a new division globally called New Power, which principally focuses on these technologies. And therefore, as we look at it, where we stand today, obviously there is a fair amount of interest from some of our customers to look for these solutions. And we are actively engaged with some of the customers to really put in place what I would call initially as a demonstrator units to establish the technology, establish the operating environment in which it can function, and then look at ways in which it can expand and gain scale for a much broader and deeper application in the economy.
Mr. Patil, as you pivot from being a a traditional energy solution provider to a new energy solution provider, will all the new incubation be done in the listed entity or will it be in the subsidiary?
The businesses or the portfolio which is there in the listed entity will continue. As an example, if there are end markets or customers which are serviced by the listed entity, the newer technologies will go through the listed entity for those applications. As an example, when it comes to power generation, DG sets, railways, mining, those are construction equipment. Those are the segments which are served from this entity. And we will introduce newer technologies at appropriate time in the future when these segments are ready to receive those.
Raja, as you go about pursuing new energy transition projects, I just wanted to understand whether or not the margin levers are in place, because clearly supply chain challenges had marred industries across the board.
No, certainly. I mean, I'll answer your question in two parts. So the first part is, of course, near term tactically, we are exposed to high commodity inflation, which we have been addressing through a combination of actions. So on one side, we have a very matured internal, cost optimization programs, which has been running for years in a very disciplined manner. And number two, obviously, we have taken some actions on the pricing side to mitigate the impact. Was that fully enough to mitigate the entire commodity inflation? The answer is no, simply because there is a lag effect that we have to deal with. And that's the reason, if you would have seen our material margin or a gross margin, we have a 100 basis point impact on that when you see from a year to date 9 months perspective. Having said, the other aspect which we have done is to look at all our fixed and discretionary costs such that we manage that in a very prudent manner, and also drive a very productive leverage as the volumes are ramped up. And as a consequence, when you look at our PBIT margins, those have expanded 60 basis points compared to FY 19-20. So while on one hand, we certainly have a commodity inflation, but the other levers that we have managed very effectively meant that we are able to expand the margin even compared to 19-20. Now, going forward, how does this play out? I mean, clearly, to take on from the previous question that was asked, I think when you look at some of the newer products, the scale of those products, the pace at which they get adopted, I think is an important aspect in order for us to have a very good cost position for the newer technologies. A bit early because some of these technologies are just about being spoken and we are in the very early stages of introducing those technologies in the market.
Ajay, great to have you on board today. Thank you so much for taking the time out.